Rambo 2. This is one of the more influential films made since 1980. Every other action film ever made, especially those trying to reap more money from which they were made with, resorted to some guy gunning people down in the jungle. Die Hard would fairly swiftly prove a more viable formula for mainstream Hollywood action films at one time, but especially direct-to-video/DVD films, holy hell did they love Rambo 2. Funny, this film influenced the nature of Italian knockoff action/war films. A slew of them follow from Rambo 2/Commando, both 1985. We saw, for instance, Antonio Margheriti's Commando Leopard with Klaus Kinski that same year, which might be better than both films, as in more entertaining, though lacking Arnold's one-liners or skills of gardening tools. This film influenced the culture of the world as we know it. It firmly implanted the ripped, raging, machine gun firing super soldier as the new image of basely gratifying Hollywood exceptionalism to replace the Duke on horseback. Rambo 2, these films, directly influenced the Metal Gear franchise. Kojima thought this trilogy was really deep. Can you find love on a battlefield? Or whatever Sniper Wolf said. I don't know. Always forgetting about having to go back and find the bullets earlier in the game's map annoyed me, so I never sympathised with her personally. All this talk of soldiers and purpose and war and generals and bureaucracy and data and war, it feeds into all the pretensions of the Metal Gear Solid series, except when Sons of Liberty became obsessed with Serial Experiments Lane or something similar, but that was a whole other thing. Anyway, the director of this film, speaking of the Italian knockoffs earlier, was one George P. Cosmatos, an Italian-born filmmaker of Greek parentage who directed the 1973 Euro War Macaroni Combat feature Massacre in Rome as his sophomore work. And yes, he is the father of the very interesting contemporary filmmaker Panos Cosmatos. This was followed by 1976's The Cassandra Crossing, an Italian-produced thriller which saw co-funding from the United Kingdom and West Germany, a train-based disaster film possibly inspired by similar American films, although revolving around the release of a deadly disease. I remember thoroughly enjoying both films, and also the 1979 Escape to Athena, another war picture, starring Roger Moore and David Niven, among others. 1983's Of Unknown Origin featured Buckaroo Banzai himself, Peter Weller, up against a very nasty rat loose in his home. That is good stuff, pretty damn intense. And so they handed Cosmatos his most prospectively profitable and almost certainly the worst film he had made up to that point. But wait, what director would turn down the opportunity to work with the legend involved in making this film what it is today? The true reason this film was iconic, as we all know, or ought to know, is the sharp, luscious and involving, professional, seamless, vivid photography of Jack Cardiff. Yes, to the snobs who have already turned this video off and unsubscribed. I click subscribe on a video about Bela Taro, Mikio Naruse, or Guy Debord. What is this false advertising? I feel you. This film was shot by Jack Cardiff, and it looks pretty good, doesn't it? These movies had to look good if they were to be as successful as they were, and it wouldn't have been if it didn't look as vivid and lived in as it does. Cardiff's photography, I like to suspect, is the key to this film's success. Mexico is very effectively disguised as Southeast Asia, so it appears. Meanwhile, composer Jerry Goldsmith, who also has a highly accomplished history in his field, impresses less. Makes less of an impression on a viewer. His work could have been anyone's here, I feel. Such a silly film. The trashy Hollywood imitator without subtlety or grace of the Euro, mainly Italian, imitators found itself in Hollywood with Rambo 2, and Hollywood's audiences rejoiced. This was everything that they'd ever wanted. A European trash imitation of Hollywood blockbusters which has found its way into Hollywood and funded with the resources of the productions which inspired the initial European imitators. Yes. And Hollywood films in general of the action variety, more interested in function than form, perceived Rambo 2 as the new, superior gospel. Although I will briefly commend some of the film's attempts at sincere commentary on the American military-industrial complex, Rambo is assured by his former superior officer, Colonel Troutman, that they will get to win this time, a quote which leaks this film's own covert operation. Well, isn't that subtle? If I were to be more pompous, I might pen written reviews in a verbose style which doesn't remotely reflect how I or anyone else speaks or thinks, titling us or subtitling them with a quote from the film itself, as the review is rather an essay on the film's potential relevance, a piece to promote myself as a trendy author rather than the film itself. I might have used the quote, Don't be a hero. Troutman is held at gunpoint as one of Murdoch's officers prevents him from assisting Rambo in the rescued missing POW. Rather than being a thesis to advance my career in film criticism or academia, has anyone ever attempted this of Rambo 2? I present this piece here as proof that the Italians, in some respect, knew the fundamental quality of a Hollywood blockbuster's appeal as near mindless gratifying slop, as set pieces indulgence and exploiting sex and or violence. Hitchcock once claimed in the 1960s that in filmmaking the Italians are way ahead of any of us, meaning I guess the English-speaking world, and while, yes, he was referring to Fellini and Antonioni, given the giallo market's foreshadowing of the 1980s American slasher, of course, the vulgar Italian imitator action film, commandeering the nature of America's own action films eventually in the explosive 1980s, or even the self-referential postmodern approach of 1990s onward English-language art or indie cinema, if we're on Fellini and or Antonioni. The Italians, Sorrentino and Garrone, great filmmakers they might well be, have now resorted to plagiarizing their own nation's history for sources for allegedly new art cinema. In before there are no new ideas. If something feels new, that is honestly enough for a vast majority of audiences, myself included. By God, how many people were raised on this film? Explains quite a bit. I once saw a flash video someone made on newgrounds.com wherein they had a clip from this film and Metal Slug, the video game, sound effects played over it. You know, as Rambo shoots baddies and rescues POWs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's what this film is, a video game's idea of armed conflict, and video games before they got all pretentious to hide the propaganda. Call of Duty 4, Spec Ops The Line, I see through it. More yank wank. Anyway, Rambo 2, disgusting. But I still love Jack Cardiff. Appreciate the net positive of the Cosmatos family's contribution to film art, and I'm struggling to think of what the hell can be said about bloody Rambo 3, which is allowed to be the supposedly most expensive film ever made at that time. What a simpler time.